Husband was in shock when he found out what I had hidden inside the contract he blindly signed. Imagine dedicating your life to someone, believing in their love, only to be discarded like yesterday's trash. That was my reality until I turned the tables in a way he never saw coming. He thought he could walk away unscathed, but what he didn't know was that I had the ultimate surprise waiting for him. What was hidden inside the contract he signed? How did I make him regret every cruel word he ever said to me? Stay with me, because this story takes a turn so shocking you won't believe how it ends. The weight of the scrapbook felt heavier in my hands than it should have. I had spent weeks perfecting every page, carefully curating our memories, crafting each detail with love. It was supposed to be special, a gift to remind Nathan of everything we had built together, a reminder of the life we had, the life we were supposed to cherish. But as I watched him toss it onto the coffee table like garbage, something inside me cracked. The sound of the hardcover hitting the wood was sharp, final, like the snapping of something fragile that could never be put back together. Useless, Nathan muttered, shaking his head, barely sparing it a glance. My chest tightened. What? He gestured lazily at the book, his expression flat with disinterest. This? A pile of pictures and sentimental garbage? This is the best you could come up with? God, Lillian, you're ridiculous. I clenched my hands in my lap, willing myself to stay calm. I thought you'd appreciate something meaningful. It's a collection of everything we've been through together. Nathan let out a sharp, humorless laugh, standing up and running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. What we've been through. Please. The first so tired of all this overly emotional crap. You could have gotten me something useful, but instead you waste time on this nonsense. It's embarrassing. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the sting behind my eyes, but I refused to let him see me break. Not now. Not anymore. I swallowed hard. I thought, no, he interrupted, his voice growing sharper. You don't get it, do you? This isn't working anymore. You're not working anymore. My breath caught in my throat. What are you saying? Nathan smirked, crossing his arms. I'm leaving, Lillian. I've met someone else. The world around me seemed to tilt, but I forced myself to stay still, my nails digging into the cushion beneath me. You're what? Nathan exhaled, his smirk widening, like he had been waiting for this moment. Like he had planned this. Her name's Sierra. She's 20, she's exciting, and she actually knows how to have fun. Unlike you. The words should have devastated me. The betrayal should have shattered me. But instead, something unexpected happened. I laughed. It wasn't bitter or forced. It was real, cutting through the tension like a knife. Nathan's smug expression faltered. What the hell is so funny? I stood, brushing non-existent dust from my dress, and reached for the scrapbook. You don't even know what you're walking away from. Nathan frowned, suspicion flickering in his eyes. What are you talking about? I flipped to the final page, where a crisp, neatly folded deed was tucked inside a pocket. I had sewn in myself. Slowly, I pulled it out, unfolding it with delicate precision before holding it up between us. This, I said, my voice cool and steady, is the deed to a vacation house. I bought it for us. I was going to surprise you tonight, but I guess that's off the table now. Nathan's jaw dropped, the confidence drained from his face, replaced by pure disbelief. You bought a vacation house? I smiled sweetly, slipping the deed into my purse. Looks like Sierra won't be enjoying that, will she? For the first time all evening, Nathan was silent. He stood there, his mouth opening and closing as if he was trying to formulate a response, but nothing came out. You bought a house? He finally managed, his voice lacking the arrogance it held moments ago. Since when do you make decisions like that? I tilted my head, my gaze unwavering. Since I realized I can't depend on you for anything meaningful. Nathan looked like he had been punched in the gut. Lillian, wait. I held up a hand, cutting him off. No, Nathan. You made your choice. Take Sierra, take your exciting life, and get out of mine. I turned on my heel, walking toward the bedroom, leaving him standing there. His sputtering excuses followed me, but I didn't care. I reached for a small suitcase, throwing in a few essentials with practiced ease. As I zipped up the bag, my gaze drifted to the dresser. Framed photos of a life that no longer existed stared back at me, wedding pictures, vacations, moments that once held promise. Now, they felt like relics from a past I no longer recognized. By the time I returned to the living room, Nathan was pacing, his hands on his hips, his mind clearly racing to figure out a way to salvage this. "You're really just gonna leave?" he asked, his tone incredulous. I met his gaze, my voice calm, final. "I am. This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're being petty, Lillian. You'll regret this." I reached for the door handle, pausing only briefly. "Maybe. But at least I won't regret staying in a marriage where I'm nothing but a joke to you." With that, I stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin like a long-awaited embrace. As I walked toward my car, the weight of Nathan's expectations lifted from my shoulders, and for the first time in years I felt free. The deed was safe in my purse. I wasn't just leaving with my belongings. I was leaving with something far more valuable: clarity. Let Nathan have his fun. I was done playing the part of the loyal wife in his selfish little game. As I pulled onto the road, I knew exactly where I was going. Grace's house. Grace was the only person who would truly understand what had just happened without judgment, without hesitation. When I knocked on her door, it only took a second before she swung it open, her eyes narrowing at the sight of me standing there with a suitcase in one hand and a purse clutched tightly in the other. "What did he do this time?" Grace asked, her voice flat but laced with fury. I exhaled. "Can I come in?" Grace stepped aside instantly. "Of course. Kitchen or living room?" I smiled faintly. "Kitchen." Grace nodded knowingly. "Good. That means you need wine." Minutes later, we were seated at the small kitchen table, a glass of Merlot in front of me, Grace watching me intently from across the table. "So," Grace said, leaning back, arms crossed. "Spill." I took a deep breath, the events of the night settling in, the scrapbook, the cruel words, the smirk, the 20-year-old, the vacation house. And as I started to tell my best friend everything, I realized something. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. This was the beginning of something else entirely. The weight of everything that had just happened settled over me like a heavy fog as I sat at Grace's kitchen table, my fingers wrapped around the stem of my wine glass. The warm glow of the pendant light above us cast soft shadows across the room, the only thing making the moment feel remotely real. Grace leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table, eyes sharp and filled with a protective fire I had always loved about her. "So," she said, drawing out the word, "Nathan is a complete and utter piece of trash. What else is new?" I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. "This time is different." Grace's brow arched. "Different how?" Did he suddenly grow a conscience? Realize he's been a selfish asshole for the last 10 years? I took a slow sip of wine, the bitterness lingering on my tongue. "He told me he's leaving. For someone younger." Grace set her glass down a little too forcefully. "That son of a..." I held up a hand, stopping her mid-rant. "Oh, it gets better." He laughed at the scrapbook I made him, called it useless, said I was embarrassing. Her jaw clenched so hard I thought she might shatter her teeth. "Lillian." "And then," I continued, my voice eerily calm, "he told me he'd been seeing someone. Sierra. She's 20. Apparently she's exciting and knows how to have fun." I made air quotes with my fingers, my tone dripping with mockery, unlike me. Grace exhaled sharply, pushing herself up from the table and pacing the small kitchen. "I swear to God, I always knew he was a narcissistic asshole, but this is next level insanity." I watched her for a moment, then set my glass down, feeling the weight of what I had done. "I didn't argue with him, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. You know what I did?" Grace stopped pacing. "What?" I laughed. Her brows lifted. Wait, you laughed? At him? I nodded, a small smirk tugging at the corner of my lips. He was so smug, so convinced that he had the upper hand, that I'd crumble at his feet. But instead, I just laughed. And then I showed him the deed to the vacation house I bought. Grace's mouth fell open. Oh my God. Please tell me his face was priceless. I leaned back in my chair, the memory of his stunned expression playing in my mind. He looked like someone had just slapped him with a brick. Grace let out a whoop, clapping her hands together. That's what I'm talking about. You finally turned the tables on him, and he never saw it coming. The rush of satisfaction I had felt in that moment had been intoxicating, but as the adrenaline faded, reality settled in. But now what? I asked, more to myself than to Grace. I walked out. I took my things, but now what? Grace sat back down, her expression softening. Now, you figure out what you want. You've spent years living for him, Lillian. What do you want? That question was terrifying. I had been with Nathan for so long that I wasn't sure who I was without him. Not that I wanted him back, not in a million years, but the realization that my life had revolved around someone who never truly valued me was a bitter pill to swallow. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I don't even know where to start. Grace reached across the table, squeezing my hand. That's okay. You don't have to have all the answers tonight. But promise me one thing, don't let him drag you back in. I nodded, though deep down I knew Nathan. He wasn't the kind of man who let go easily. That night, I lay awake in Grace's guest room, staring at the ceiling, the events of the evening playing on repeat in my mind. The way Nathan had looked at me when I pulled out that deed, the disbelief, the panic, the fact that, for the first time, I had been the one with the upper hand. I reached for my phone, instinctively checking for messages. And sure enough, there they were. Nathan, Lillian, come home. Let's talk. Nathan, you're being irrational. We can figure this out. Nathan, fine. Be petty. But don't expect me to come running when you change your mind. I scoffed, rolling my eyes. He really thought he still had that kind of power over me? That I'd be the one begging him to stay? I didn't respond. Instead, I turned off my phone and placed it face down on the nightstand. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of bacon sizzling in the kitchen. Grace was already up, flipping pancakes like she was hosting a Sunday brunch. She glanced at me over her shoulder. You look like hell, I snorted, running a hand through my tangled hair. Thanks. Did you sleep? I shrugged, sliding into a chair. A little. She set a plate in front of me before taking a seat across the table. He texted, didn't he? I nodded, stabbing my fork into a pancake. Told me to come home, then tried to act like I was the irrational one. And when that didn't work, he resorted to threats. Grace groaned. God, he's so predictable. I exhaled. Yeah, but it's not over. Nathan's not the kind of man who just walks away quietly. Grace studied me for a moment before nodding. Then we plan ahead. We make sure you're protected. Financially, legally, emotionally, everything. A lump formed in my throat. I hate that it has to be like this. I know, she said softly. But you're not alone in this, Lillian. You have me. I smiled weakly, grateful for her unwavering support. That day, we drove to my lawyer's office, making sure every legal loose end was tied up. I didn't just want a divorce. I wanted to make sure Nathan couldn't manipulate his way back into my life. I froze all shared accounts, transferred everything under my name, and had the vacation house secured in a way that ensured he couldn't touch it. By the time we were done, I felt exhausted. But for the first time in years, I also felt in control. Later that evening, as Grace and I sat on the back porch of her house, sipping wine and watching the sun dip below the trees, I finally let myself breathe. You did good today, Grace murmured. I exhaled slowly. Yeah, but I have a feeling this isn't the last I'll hear from him. Grace tilted her head, studying me. No, probably not. But the next time he comes knocking, you'll be ready. I nodded, gripping my glass a little tighter. Because as much as I wanted this to be the end of Nathan's hold on me, I knew better. This wasn't over. Not yet. He thought he had it all figured out. He was moving on, leaving me behind, and starting fresh with someone younger. But here's where it gets interesting. Because I wasn't the naive, heartbroken wife he expected me to be. I had something up my sleeve, something that would change everything. Do you think he realized his mistake before it was too late? Or did he dig his own grave without even knowing it? Comment 1 if you think he saw it coming. Or 2 if you think he walked straight into his downfall without a clue. Let's see who guesses right. The morning air felt crisp against my skin as I stepped out onto Grace's back porch. A steaming cup of coffee cradled between my hands. The world outside was still quiet, the early light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the wooden deck. I took a slow sip, savoring the warmth, the bitter taste, the simple fact that this morning was mine, no expectations, no forced smiles, no pretending, just me. It had been 3 days since I walked out on Nathan. 3 days since I left behind years of my life, years of compromise, years of shrinking myself to fit into a version of me he found tolerable. And yet, despite the distance, despite the silence, I could still feel him lingering like an unwelcome ghost in the corners of my mind. I hadn't responded to his texts, hadn't answered his calls. He had started with guilt, then frustration, then outright anger. But I had ignored every single one. Grace had insisted on blocking his number, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, not yet. Some foolish part of me wanted to see how far he would go, how desperate he would become when he realized I wasn't playing his game anymore. The screen door creaked behind me, and I turned to see Grace, her messy bun barely holding on to the chaos of her curls. She was holding her own coffee, her expression groggy but alert. "You're up early," she muttered, taking a sip. I shrugged. Couldn't sleep. She plopped down on the chair next to me, tucking her legs beneath her. "Let me guess. Nathan?" I let out a dry chuckle. "Who else?" she sighed, setting her cup down on the table. "You know he's not going to stop, right? Not until he finds a way to make you doubt yourself." "I know," I admitted. And I did. Nathan wasn't the type to accept losing. He'd see my leaving as an insult, an attack on his ego. And men like him didn't take those lightly. Grace studied me for a moment, then reached for her phone. "Okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make a plan." "A plan?" I raised an eyebrow. "Yes, a plan." She tapped on her screen, her voice firm. "You need to secure everything, your finances, your assets, that beautiful vacation house you snatched right out from under him." A proud smirk crossed her lips. God, that was satisfying. I exhaled, setting my cup down. Already took care of most of it with my lawyer. "Nathan can't touch a thing," Grace nodded approvingly. "Good. But that doesn't mean he won't try something else." That thought sent a chill down my spine. Because she was right. Nathan wouldn't let this go. He couldn't. And I had to be ready for whatever came next. Later that afternoon, I decided it was time. Time to go back to face what I had left behind and make sure I took everything that was mine before Nathan had a chance to twist the narrative. Grace, of course, insisted on coming with me. The drive to the house felt surreal. The familiarity of the roads, the turns, the landmarks, all of it felt distant, like I was returning to a place that had never truly belonged to me. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter as we approached the driveway, my stomach twisting into knots. When I pulled up, I wasn't surprised to see Nathan's car still parked out front. "He's here," I muttered. Grace scoffed. "Of course he is. The man-child probably thinks you're coming back to apologize." I took a deep breath, steadying myself before stepping out. Grace followed close behind, her presence a silent source of strength. As I reached for the doorknob, it swung open before I could touch it. Nathan stood there, arms crossed, an infuriating smirk on his lips. Well, look who finally decided to show up. I met his gaze evenly. "I'm here for my things," he chuckled, stepping aside. "Be my guest." I walked past him, the familiar scent of the house hitting me all at once, his cologne, the faint smell of coffee, the lingering traces of a life I had once tried so desperately to hold together. But now, it just felt foreign. Grace didn't waste time. She marched straight to the bedroom, grabbing the suitcase I had left behind. I followed her lead, methodically moving through the house, picking up only what belonged to me. Nathan, of course, wasn't done talking. "You really think you're better off without me?" His voice carried from the doorway as I packed. "Come on, Lillian, be serious." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. "I mean, let's face it," he continued, stepping inside the room. "You don't have a plan. You don't even know what you're doing. You're just running because you think it makes you strong." I zipped up my bag, turning to face him. "No, Nathan, I'm not running. I'm choosing myself for once." His jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly, shaking his head with a chuckle. "You're making a mistake." Grace appeared in the hallway, arms full of my things. "The only mistake she ever made was wasting time on you." Nathan's eyes flicked to her, his irritation barely concealed. "Of course, you're here. Should have figured you'd be fueling this little meltdown." Grace flashed a saccharine smile. "Meltdown? Honey, this is a revolution." Nathan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple like we were exhausting him. "Fine. If this is what you want, then go. But don't come crawling back when you realize you need me." I smiled, shaking my head. "You still don't get it, do you? I never needed you. I just thought I did." For the first time, something in his expression faltered. It was small, barely there, but I saw it, the crack in his confidence. The realization creeping in that maybe, just maybe, he had actually lost me. I turned, grabbing my bags, and without another word, walked past him. Grace followed, not sparing him a glance as we headed for the front door. The moment I stepped outside, a weight lifted from my chest. The sky was clearer, the air fresher, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Nathan didn't follow us. He didn't call after me. He just stood there, watching as I walked away, and I didn't look back. As I got into the car and started the engine, Grace let out a slow breath. Holy shit. That was empowering. I laughed, the sound surprising even myself. Yeah, it was. We pulled away from the house, leaving it all behind. And as I drove, I realized something. I wasn't just taking my things. I was taking back my life. The road stretched out before me, long and empty, the hum of the tires against the pavement, the only sound breaking the silence. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her eyes flicking between me and the side mirror as if expecting Nathan to suddenly appear behind us, chasing me down like some deranged movie villain. But he wouldn't. I knew Nathan. He thrived on control, but he wouldn't risk looking desperate. Not yet. He would wait, biding his time, believing that the longer he stayed silent, the more uncertain I'd become. That was his game, always had been. But this time, I wasn't playing. I kept my grip steady on the wheel, my mind racing through the last hour. The confrontation, the way Nathan had looked at me when he realized I was truly done, the flicker of disbelief in his eyes, quickly masked by arrogance. He had always underestimated me, always assumed I would fall back in line, that I wouldn't have the courage to leave him completely. But I had, and now I was free. Grace exhaled beside me, rubbing her hands over her face. "Jesus, Lillian, the first can't believe that just happened." I let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, me neither." She turned toward me, studying my face like she was waiting for some kind of breakdown, some sign that I was regretting it. But there was none. The weight on my chest had lifted, the years of second-guessing myself vanishing the moment I walked out that door. Still, my hands were gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, my body buzzing with an energy I couldn't quite place. "I should have punched him," Grace muttered, shaking her head. "Or at least thrown something at his smug-ass face." I smirked. Tempting. But you know how he is. He'd have spun it into some ridiculous story about how I'm the crazy one. Grace scoffed. "Like he's not already doing that." She reached for her phone, scrolling through something before holding it up. He's already changed his relationship status on Facebook. I glanced at the screen just long enough to catch the words, "in a relationship with Sierra Martinez," the 20-year-old, the one he had so proudly declared as his replacement for me. A slow breath left my lips. I should have been angry, should have felt hurt, but all I felt was relief. Let him have her. Let her deal with his manipulations, his constant need for control, his insufferable ego. Grace, however, was fuming. He really thinks this is gonna hurt you, doesn't he? Like you're sitting here crying over some girl who wasn't even born when Titanic came out. I laughed, a real laugh this time. Let him think whatever he wants. It's not my problem anymore. She grinned. Damn right. We drove in comfortable silence for a while, the city slowly fading into open fields and stretches of highway that led nowhere in particular. I didn't have a destination in mind, just away from the life I had spent too many years trapped in. But I knew I couldn't just run. Eventually, I had to decide what came next. Where are we going? I asked after a while. Grace shrugged. Where do you want to go? I thought about it. The vacation house? Maybe. But something about going there immediately felt too much like hiding. I needed time, space. Somewhere that doesn't feel like his, I said finally. She nodded in understanding. I know just the place. An hour later, we pulled up to a small coastal town, one of those quiet places that didn't try too hard to be charming but ended up being exactly that. Grace had brought me here once years ago, back when I was still trying with Nathan, still convincing myself that the cracks in our marriage were just normal wear and tear instead of the foundation crumbling beneath my feet. We checked into a small inn overlooking the water, the scent of salt and sea breeze filling the air as I stepped out of the car. The waves crashed softly in the distance, a rhythmic reminder that the world kept moving forward, no matter how much had changed. Grace tossed her bag over her shoulder, shooting me a look. I say we get drunk. I laughed. That's your answer to everything, she grinned. Because it works. I didn't argue. That night, we sat at a small beachside bar, the kind of place with string lights overhead and cheap cocktails that came in glasses far too large for one person. I let myself relax for the first time in what felt like forever, sipping a drink that was far too sweet, listening to Grace tell a story about her disastrous date from last month. For the first time in a long time, I felt normal. Not like someone recovering from a breakup, not like someone who had just walked away from a toxic marriage. Just a woman sitting in a bar, laughing with her best friend. And then, my phone buzzed. I froze, my pulse quickening. Grace noticed instantly. Don't, she warned. But I already knew who it was. Nathan. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the notification. Nathan, hope you're happy. You've ruined everything. I exhaled slowly. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was bait. He was testing me, trying to see if I would engage, if I would take the guilt he was offering and wrap it around myself like a chain. I locked my phone without replying. Grace raised her glass. To ignoring manipulative ex-husbands, I clinked my glass against hers. To starting over. That night, I sat on the balcony of our inn, the waves crashing against the shore in a steady rhythm. The air was warm, the sky dark, stars scattered across it like tiny, distant promises of something more. I felt lighter, freer. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Nathan wasn't done, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and freedom, but I couldn't shake the feeling creeping up my spine. Something was coming, something inevitable. I sat on the balcony of the inn, my fingers tracing the rim of my wine glass, my phone resting beside me like a silent threat. I hadn't checked it since Nathan's last message, but I knew him too well. He wouldn't just let me walk away without a fight. Grace had gone to bed an hour ago, exhausted from our night of cheap cocktails and bad karaoke at the beachside bar. She had insisted that I block Nathan's number, that I cut him off completely. But I hadn't. Not yet. Not because I wanted to talk to him, but because I needed to know. I needed to see what he would do next, and I didn't have to wait long. The screen lit up. My breath caught in my throat. Nathan, you think you're winning? You're not. You never will. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the glass. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was something else. A warning. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. He wanted me to react, to let him get under my skin, and maybe a few weeks ago he would have. But not anymore. I was done playing his games. I locked my phone without replying and leaned back against the chair, staring out at the waves. He had no power here, no control. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew Nathan. And Nathan never lost quietly. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating against the wooden nightstand. I groaned, reaching for it, expecting another one of Nathan's cryptic messages. But it wasn't him. It was my lawyer. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding as I answered. Hello? Lillian? Her voice was calm, professional, but there was something in her tone that put me on edge. I wanted to give you a heads up before you heard it from someone else. Nathan filed a motion against you this morning. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. A motion? For what? He's claiming you took marital assets without consent, she said, her words careful. Specifically, the vacation house. I let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through my hair. He thinks he can take my house? Not take, she corrected. But he's demanding financial compensation. He's arguing that since the house was purchased during the marriage, he's entitled to half its value. I stood up, pacing the small room, my pulse hammering in my ears. That's ridiculous. I bought that house alone, with my money. I know, she said gently. But legally, it's a gray area. He's hoping to drag this out, make it as painful as possible, force you into a settlement. Anger bubbled in my chest, hot and sharp. This wasn't about the house. It was never about the house. This was about control, about making sure I couldn't walk away clean, about punishing me for leaving. Lillian, my lawyer continued, her voice softer now. I need to know how you want to handle this. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. Nathan was expecting me to panic, to cave, to throw my hands up and say, fine, take what you want, just leave me alone. But he underestimated me. He always had. I exhaled slowly, my mind sharpening. We fight. A small pause. Then, approval. I was hoping you'd say that. I hung up, my entire body vibrating with fury. Grace appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, a cup of coffee in her hands. She took one look at me and sighed. What did he do now? I told her everything. By the time I finished, she was pacing, muttering curses under her breath. He's pathetic, she snapped. He can't stand the fact that you're happy without him, so he's doing the only thing he knows how, trying to ruin you. I nodded, my jaw tight. But he won't. Grace stopped, turning to me. Damn right he won't. She sat down on the edge of the bed, studying me carefully. So, what's the plan? I met her gaze, my voice steady. We hit back harder. That afternoon, I met with my lawyer in person. We went over every financial record, every transaction. I handed her every piece of evidence. I had bank statements, emails, even texts from Nathan where he explicitly stated he wanted nothing to do with the house. He's banking on you giving up, she said as she skimmed the documents. But we have enough here to prove he doesn't have a leg to stand on. I leaned forward. Then let's make sure he falls. She smiled. I'll draft our response. In the meantime, don't engage with him. No texts, no calls. He's going to try to provoke you. I smirked. Let him try. As I left her office, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I had spent so much of my life reacting to Nathan, trying to predict his next move, trying to stay ahead of the storm. But not anymore. Now, I was the storm, and Nathan had no idea what was coming. The days following Nathan's legal attack were a whirlwind of preparation, but I refused to let it consume me. I threw myself into the case, gathering every shred of proof that the house was mine, that every penny spent had come from my account, that he had never once contributed. But even as I built my defense, I knew Nathan wasn't done. He never played fair, and I had this gnawing feeling in my gut something was coming. That feeling proved right 2 days later when Grace stormed into the kitchen, her phone clutched in her hand, eyes burning with fury. "You are not going to believe this," she seethed, thrusting her phone toward me. I took it hesitantly, my stomach tightening as I read the headline plastered across the screen. "Bitter ex-wife steals dream home from loving husband, now he's fighting back." My blood ran cold. I read further, scanning the article. The words twisted reality into something grotesque. According to Nathan's exclusive interview, I had blindsided him, secretly funneling our money into buying the house before cruelly tossing him aside for a lavish, selfish escape. He painted himself as the heartbroken husband, abandoned by a wife who had grown bored and greedy. He claimed he was only fighting for justice. My hands shook as I scrolled. Photos of me, of the house, even a picture of Nathan, sitting in what looked like a dimly lit cafe, his expression somber, pained. "Son of a..." I sucked in a sharp breath, my pulse hammering. Grace crossed her arms. "It's all over the place. Some of his buddies from work shared it. People are eating it up." I clenched my jaw. Of course they are. People loved a victim. And Nathan had always known how to manipulate an audience. I exhaled, forcing myself to think, "Okay, we need to hit back," Grace grinned. "I love when you get like this." I ignored her, already pulling out my laptop. We do this smart. No emotional rants, no desperate defenses. We counter with facts. I drafted a response, not to the trashy article, but to the reality of my situation. A clear, composed statement about the truth. That I had bought the house with my own money. That Nathan had laughed when I first mentioned it. That he had chosen to walk away, and now he was bitter that I hadn't crumbled in his absence. I read it over, then hit post. Within minutes, the comments rolled in. Some were supportive, others, not so much. "You're just bitter he found someone better. Why do women always think they deserve everything? Men get screwed over in divorce all the time, finally. One's fighting back." I slammed my laptop shut, breathing hard. Grace raised an eyebrow. "You good?" I let out a sharp laugh. "Oh yeah. Just love how the internet will side with the first person to cry about being a victim." Grace sighed. "People are idiots. But you know what shuts idiots up?" I looked at her. Proof. I blinked, realization dawning. "The financial records." She grinned. "Exactly. We compiled every document, every bank statement, every receipt proving that I had paid for the house alone. Then, I sent them to my lawyer along with the article. If he wants to fight dirty," I told her, my voice steady, "then let's bury him." 2 days later, the tides turned. An independent journalist picked up my post and ran an article of their own this time, with the truth. They laid it all out, Nathan's manipulation, his outright lies, the evidence disproving every claim he had made. Screenshots of his own texts were even included, texts where he had mocked the idea of a vacation home, where he had explicitly told me he wanted no part of it. And just like that, his sob story started to fall apart. The comment sections flipped. Wow. This guy really tried to play the victim, huh? Yikes. If he lied about the house, what else did he lie about? Dude, you left her. Take the L and move on. By the end of the day, Nathan had deleted his exclusive interview post. Grace popped open a bottle of wine. To publicly humiliating manipulative exes, I clinked my glass against hers. To winning. But even as we laughed, even as the weight of Nathan's smear campaign lifted, I couldn't shake the feeling deep in my gut. This was far from over. Nathan wasn't the type to accept defeat, and something told me he wasn't done trying to take me down. The air inside the house felt heavier than usual, like something was pressing down on my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I hadn't slept. Not really. My mind had been racing all night, replaying every possible move Nathan could make next. I had exposed his lies, taken control of the narrative, but something told me he wouldn't just slink away into the shadows. That wasn't who he was. Nathan didn't lose, at least, not without trying to burn everything down on his way out. Grace was already awake when I walked into the kitchen, her expression serious as she handed me a cup of coffee. "You need to see this," she said, sliding her phone across the counter. I took it, my stomach tightening as I read the text message she had received from an unknown number. "You think this is funny? Meddling in things that don't concern you? You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't have to ask who it was from. I gripped the phone tightly. "He's threatening you now?" Grace crossed her arms. "Looks that way." My fingers clenched around the ceramic mug. "I'll handle this," she scoffed. "Oh, I know you will, but we need to be smart about it. He's unraveling, Lillian. You backed him into a corner and now he's lashing out." I exhaled, rubbing my temple. She was right. Nathan had always been calculated, cold, always 3 steps ahead. But now he was reckless, and that made him dangerous. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my unread messages. He had been quiet since deleting his post, but as I suspected, he hadn't disappeared. "You're making a mistake, Lillian. You think you won? You have no idea what you've done. I hope you're happy. You've ruined everything. This isn't over." I clenched my jaw. He wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. "Okay," I muttered. "It's time to end this." Grace raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that?" I met her gaze, my voice steady. "We stopped playing defense." The first step was a restraining order. It was something I had considered before, but now, after the threats especially against Grace, it wasn't an option. It was a necessity. The courthouse was quiet when we arrived, the kind of eerie silence that made me feel exposed. Like at any moment, Nathan could walk through the doors and try to twist the story again. But I pushed the thought aside and filled out the paperwork. When I handed it to the clerk, my hands weren't shaking. Not this time. As we left the courthouse, Grace exhaled loudly. "Well, that's done. But what's next?" I didn't hesitate. "We take away his power." She blinked. "Meaning?" "Nathan thrives on control. The moment he feels like he's losing it, he lashes out. We've seen it over and over again. So we don't just defend ourselves, we make sure he has nothing left to hold on to," Grace smirked. "I love this version of you." I shook my head, but I couldn't deny the rush of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had spent years being the woman Nathan could manipulate, the woman who second-guessed herself at every turn. But that woman was gone, and it was time Nathan learned that the hard way. That night, I received the call I had been expecting. "Lillian?" Nathan's voice came through the line, tight with barely restrained anger. "Are you seriously trying to get a restraining order against me?" I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the darkened lake beyond my window. "Not trying. I already did." Silence. Then a sharp exhale. "You're being ridiculous." "No, Nathan, you are. You showed up at my house. You tried to drag my name through the mud. You threatened my best friend." His voice dropped lower, colder. "You think a piece of paper is going to stop me?" A chill crept up my spine, but I didn't let it show. "No, but it will give me enough evidence to have you arrested the next time you so much as breathe in my direction." Silence. For the first time in our entire relationship, I could feel it, the shift, the realization that he had lost, that I wasn't coming back, wasn't bending, wasn't playing by his rules anymore. "You're going to regret this," he finally said. I smiled, the kind of smile that carried power. "No, Nathan. I regret ever letting you think you had control over me." I hung up. Grace, who had been sitting across from me the entire time, let out a slow whistle. That was hot. I laughed, the tension finally breaking. "Shut up," she grinned. "So, what now?" I took a deep breath, letting it settle. Now, we wait. Nathan had no more moves left. And for the first time, I could finally breathe. The moment I hung up the phone, A weight lifted from my chest, but it wasn't gone completely. Nathan was furious. I could hear it in his voice, the way it shook with barely contained rage. He wasn't used to losing, especially not to me. And now that he had no control left, no way to manipulate the situation in his favor, he was going to lash out in any way he could. I had seen this side of him before, the side that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I was prepared. Grace set her glass down with a sharp clink, studying me from across the table. You think that's the end of it? I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. No, he's not going to let this go that easily. She leaned back, crossing her arms. Then what's the next move? I had been thinking about that since the moment I decided to fight back. Nathan had spent years chipping away at me, making sure I never felt strong enough to stand on my own. But now, he was the one unraveling. I could hear it in his voice, the desperation creeping in. He had nothing left to hold on to, no leverage, no control. And the more he realized that, the more reckless he would become. I pushed back from the table and grabbed my phone. We cut off his oxygen supply. Grace raised an eyebrow. Meaning? I met her gaze, steady and unyielding. We make sure he has nothing left to cling to. The first thing I did was change every password, every account, every link that connected us in any way. Bank accounts, insurance, utilities, even the Netflix subscription, everything he could possibly use to worm his way back in. I locked him out of. Then I called my lawyer and made sure the restraining order was officially in motion. But it wasn't just about cutting him off financially. It was about cutting him off emotionally. Nathan thrived on control. The idea that he could still get to me, still manipulate me, was what fueled him. And I wasn't giving him that satisfaction anymore. That night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through the messages he had sent, each one growing more desperate, more erratic, I realized something. Nathan wasn't just losing control of me. He was losing control of himself. Grace peeked over my shoulder. Jesus. He's spiraling. I nodded, reading the messages aloud. You can't just erase me, Lillian. This isn't over. You think you've won? You have no idea what's coming, Grace scoffed. He's like a toddler throwing a tantrum. I set the phone down, my jaw tightening. That's what scares me. She sobered. You think he's going to do something? I didn't want to admit it, but the truth sat heavy in my gut. I think he's already planning it. The next morning, I woke up to a loud banging on the door. My heart jumped into my throat, and for a split second, panic shot through me. But then I heard Grace's voice from the hallway. I got it. I threw off the covers and rushed to the living room, arriving just as she yanked open the door. A police officer stood on the other side, his face unreadable. Lillian Carter? He asked, glancing between us. I stepped forward. That's me. He let out a sigh, pulling out a small notepad. We received a report from a Mr. Nathan Carter. He claims you've been harassing him, sending threatening messages and attempting to defame his character. I blinked. Excuse me? Grace threw her hands up. Are you kidding me? The officer held up a hand. I'm just here to ask a few questions. I clenched my jaw. Of course, Nathan would try to flip the narrative. He was losing, and this was his last-ditch effort to make himself the victim. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the kitchen and grabbed my phone. I have something better than words, officer. I pulled up the messages he had sent me, scrolling through the threats, the manipulation, the blatant proof that he was the one harassing me. The officer scanned the screen, his expression shifting. Well, that's different from what he told us, Grace snorted. No shit. He cleared his throat. Look, Miss Carter, I'm gonna be honest. Guys like him, we see it all the time. They push and push until they lose control, and then they try to play the victim. But this? He gestured to my phone. This is solid. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived, because the officer wasn't done talking. That being said, he continued, slipping his notepad back into his pocket. He's not done. He's going to try something else. He's desperate, and desperate men do stupid things. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. So what do? He met my gaze, serious and steady. Be ready. That night, I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, waiting for the next move. I knew it was coming. I felt it coming. And then, at exactly midnight, a new message appeared. Check outside. A sharp, icy dread shot through me. My breath hitched, my pulse spiking. Slowly, I set the phone down and stood. Grace tensed. Lillian? I swallowed hard. Stay here. She grabbed my wrist. Are you insane? I shook my head, forcing my voice to stay steady. I need to know. She cursed under her breath, but let me go. I walked to the front door, every step heavy with anticipation. When I reached the window, I hesitated, my fingers twitching. And then, with a deep breath, I pulled back the curtain. My stomach dropped. Nathan's car sat at the end of the driveway, his headlights off, his silhouette barely visible behind the windshield. Watching, waiting. A slow, sick smile crept across his face. My hands curled into fists. He thought he was scaring me. He thought he still had control. But what he didn't know, what he could never understand, was that I wasn't his to control anymore. I turned off the porch light, stepped back from the window, and reached for my phone. It was time to end this. The moment I turned off the porch light, I knew this was it. Nathan thought he could intimidate me, that showing up uninvited in the middle of the night would make me fold, that I'd open the door, let him back in, give him the power he so desperately craved. But he had underestimated me again. I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around my phone as I turned back toward Grace, who was still standing in the living room, her arms crossed, her expression hard. She didn't need to ask what I had seen. The tension in my face said it all. He's out there, isn't he? I nodded. End of the driveway, just sitting there, watching. Grace cursed under her breath. That's it. I'm calling the cops. I didn't stop her this time. I could still see his shadow behind the windshield, his body language relaxed, confident-like. He thought this was just another game of push and pull, like he was waiting for me to make the first move. But I wasn't playing by his rules anymore. The operator picked up almost immediately, and Grace didn't waste a second. Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser. My friend has a restraining order against her ex, and he's sitting at the end of her driveway in the middle of the night. Yes, right now. I tuned out the rest of the conversation, my focus locked on the dark outline of Nathan's car. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He was waiting. He wanted me to panic, to run outside screaming, to give him the satisfaction of knowing he still had control over my emotions. Not this time. I took a deep breath, then another. Grace hung up. Cops are on their way. They said not to engage. I let out a short, humorless laugh. I don't plan to. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. My heartbeat thrummed in my ears, every sound amplified in the silence. And then, finally, the distant glow of red and blue lights cut through the darkness. Nathan must have seen them too, because his car rumbled to life. "Oh no, you don't," I muttered, grabbing my phone and snapping a picture of his plates just as he reversed down the road, disappearing into the night. When the officer arrived, I barely heard his questions. My mind was somewhere else, already thinking 10 steps ahead. "Do you have a restraining order against him?" "Yes." "Has he tried to contact you?" I showed them the messages. The officer's jaw tightened. "That's enough for us to escalate this. Escalate." The words settled deep in my bones. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was taking action. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice steady. The officer tucked his notepad away. "If he comes back, he's going straight to jail." For the first time in years, I felt safe. Nathan had lost. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows, the scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a brief, blissful moment, I forgot everything that had happened. Then my phone buzzed. Not from Nathan, from my lawyer. I picked up, my stomach tightening. Lillian, we need to talk. I sat up straighter. What is it? You're going to want to see this for yourself. Minutes later, I was scrolling through an article that had just hit the news. Nathan's face stared back at me, the headline making my breath catch. Local businessman arrested for violating restraining order. I exhaled sharply, scanning the details. After leaving my house, Nathan had been pulled over a few towns away. He had been belligerent, refused to cooperate, and when they ran his record, they found a history of complaints against him, complaints I hadn't even known existed. This wasn't his first time pulling stunts like this, but it was his last. I set my phone down, my hands shaking not from fear, but from relief. Grace walked into the room holding 2 mugs of coffee. You look like you just saw a ghost. I let out a breathless laugh, holding up my phone. Close. Nathan's in jail. Her eyes widened. Are you serious? I nodded. They found complaints against him. Women before me. He was never charged, but this time with the restraining order. I didn't have to finish. Grace set the coffee down, then grinned. So what you're telling me is, we won? I let the words sink in. We won. For the first time I could breathe. Really breathe. No more looking over my shoulder. No more waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Nathan was out of my life. For good. The next few weeks felt like waking up from a bad dream. I started to reclaim the pieces of myself I had lost, little by little. I went back to my photography, pouring my energy into something that was mine. I started sleeping through the night without fear. And then, one day, an email changed everything. Subject, speaking opportunity. I skimmed through it, my pulse quickening. A women's organization had heard about my story. They wanted me to speak, to share what I had been through, to help others find the strength to leave toxic situations. I hesitated. For so long, I had been defined by my past. Did I really want to relive it? But then I thought about all the nights I had spent feeling trapped, feeling alone. If hearing my story could help just one woman walk away before it was too late, wasn't that worth it? I hit reply. I'd be honored. The event was packed. Dozens of women filled the seats, all looking up at me, waiting. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. My name is Lillian, I began, my voice steady. And for years, I let someone else define my worth. I let someone tell me I wasn't enough, that I wasn't strong enough, smart enough, worthy enough. Silence. I met their eyes one by one. But here's the thing. No one gets to decide your worth except you. A murmur of agreement swept through the audience. For a long time, I thought leaving meant I had failed. That walking away from the life I built meant I was giving up. But I was wrong. Walking away wasn't giving up. It was taking my life back. Applause. I let the moment settle before delivering the final blow. My story isn't special. It's not unique. There are thousands of women out there going through the same thing. And if you're one of them, if you're sitting here wondering if you have the strength to leave, I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. You do. A standing ovation. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't wipe them away. Because this was the moment I had been waiting for. Not when Nathan left, not when he was arrested. This, taking my power back, owning my story. And finally being free. I didn't just walk away. I walked away with power, with proof, and with everything he thought he'd keep for himself. While he was busy chasing a fantasy, I was securing my future. And by the time he realized what he lost, it was too late. But here's the real question. Do you think he tried one last desperate move to get me back? Or did I shut him down for good? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you loved this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience, revenge, and justice. Walking away isn't weakness, it's survival. I spent years believing love meant sacrifice, that enduring mistreatment was better than being alone. But I was wrong. No one should tolerate disrespect, manipulation, or control. In America, we celebrate freedom, yet too many people remain trapped in toxic relationships, afraid of the unknown. But here's the truth. Real strength isn't staying, it's leaving. It's choosing yourself when no one else will. If you're in a situation where you feel small, unheard, or worthless, know this: you deserve better. Stand up, walk away, and never apologize for reclaiming your life.